Hey everybody, Spotify is a pretty good app, not gonna lie. But again, thanks for giving me the time today. I'm here to talk about Hendrix, Spotify's internal ML platform, and how it really helps, how we're building it up to enable this more traceable and auditable machine learning experience. So it's going to be a little bit of a departure from the last couple of talks. They were much more much more applied ML heavy. This is going to be more of a platform driven talk, but bear with me. A little bit about me first, though. So, like I said, I'm Jonathan. I'm a senior ML platform engineer here at Spotify. My focuses revolve mostly around workflow orchestration and compute management on the team. There's some cloud infra work thrown in on the side because that's kind of just how it is nowadays. But previously, I've also worked on similar ML infrastructure work at NVIDIA as part of their self-driving car division, as well as at Twitter as a member of Cortex. And before that, I did completely not ML-related stuff at Uber and OkCupid, actually. To give a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, first I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up about what Hendrix is exactly at a high level, and then I'm going to talk about two of these sort of topics that I want to dive a little bit in on today. One of them is going to be this notion, this conceptual framework that we're calling the Hendrix Ontology for machine learning, as well as sort of our approach to metadata on the platform and how we're using that as sort of the backbone of our infrastructure. And then, to sort of concretize all of that, I'm going to go into a specific case study about how these two concepts, what came into play for some recent developments on our platform. And then I'm going to conclude by giving you all sort of like a preview of what's next for Hendrix. So again, what exactly is Hendrix? To put it really simply, it's Spotify's internal centralized machine learning platform. The idea being that we want to take care of all these sort of operational work that goes into putting a machine learning model into production so that our applied engineers, our researchers, scientists, and data scientists don't really have to think about that. It covers all the usual suspects: model training, model evaluation, serving. But it really is trying to cover all these stuff. I think our target audience naturally is every single team within Spotify that uses machine learning in some way, shape, or form. And barring like feature gaps here and there, I think that is the goal that we try to strive for. Hendrix is built on this observation, ultimately, that machine learning practitioners are not a monolith. When you say that someone does machine learning, what does that really mean? There's a very wide spectrum of not just skill sets, but also toolkits that you can, if you look at an ML engineer at Spotify, a data scientist, a research scientist, they don't always overlap, and more often than not, they just fundamentally don't. So it's hard as a result to sort of build one platform with one single set of assumptions and cater to all of those we'll call them user personas at once. I think this definitely holds true at Spotify, and I'm sure that elements of this apply across broader industry as well. That being said, as difficult as it is, Hendrix really is trying to expand outwards to sort of accommodate as many of these sorts of user sets as possible. Where, especially moving into 2023, now that we've officially called our platform Hendrix, we're moving towards this sort of environment where we focus more on a pick and choose approach to standardization of our tooling, and the emphasis being much more on these sort of modular, augmentable systems that sort of empower all aspects of the development lifecycle. So this brings me sort of to the first of these concepts that I alluded to earlier. It's this conceptual framework that we call the Hendrix Ontology for machine learning. The premise here is really actually kind of simple. We noticed while we were developing some of these sub-products that there was a lot of friction that sort of ended up being created when you have say 5 products within your platform. They have these sort of these very similar concepts for things like a model, or what exactly a model variant constitutes, what a variant even means really. And when these definitions only kind of sort of not really match up, it creates a lot of friction for users, for practitioners within Spotify of machine learning. And given that machine learning is already a complex enough and ever-evolving field in the first place, the last thing that an ML platform should really do is really add on more complexity there. So the idea here being that by having this really robust and very well-defined and concrete set of unifying concepts within the platform, a user team that's, say, only using the serving component of Hendrix, but eventually wants to expand their usage to, say, pipeline orchestration, can reuse effectively their existing knowledge of the platform across all these products. It makes expanding a user's adoption of Hendrix much easier. It makes us happier. It's really a win-win solution. And that sort of brings me to the next topic here, and that's really metadata and the role that metadata plays within Hendrix. I might have mentioned this already, but metadata really is the backbone of our platform. Slides got kind of messed up there, but again, bear with me. But again, it really ties into every product within Hendrix. So for example, if we look at Hendrix Workflows, the product that I work on, metadata encompasses all these sort of like operational mechanical aspects, such as like, where this pipeline ran, what data points did it pull from, where did it eventually output this trained model to. But it also includes aspects such as experimentation data to allow user teams to sort of like cross-compare how different variations of a model performed relative to each other, so they know which one they eventually do want to deploy. And speaking of deployment, if we're talking about Hendrix serving, for example, the metadata layer is exactly where it's going to pull, for example, like where all the available models are for a user team to deploy to their user-facing production services. And as we've really noticed that this has paid off a lot for us over the years, and based off of that, our theory is that it's going to continue to pay further dividends down the line as we expand out Hendrix's future product offerings to encompass more of these sort of value adds. One of which, observability is one of them, model governance, the list goes on. And diving back into the experimentation aspect of this a little bit, because I really think this factors into the case study that I want to talk about later. If we're talking about this unified metadata layer, when it comes to experimentation, it really offers a level of flexibility in terms of like how users decide to pick where they decide to run their experiments. Like, we have managed Kubeflow infrastructure as part of Hendrix as an example, but and that's a really great place for users within Spotify to run their experiments. We have all this very streamlined tooling to accommodate that. But if a user, say, wanted to run their experiments locally on a notebook, or even if that notebook were being executed remotely on a notebook server, we want to essentially meet users where they are, right? We don't want, like I said before, complex enough field as it is, we don't want to impose further restrictions on the users. We really want to meet our practitioners where they are and provide value to them in any way that we can. That actually brings me to the case study, actually. So I want to talk a little bit about our focus on generalized experiment tracking for Kubeflow and Ray within the Hendrix platform, and sort of how metadata and generalized our metadata layer help to accommodate that. Sorry about that. So to give some context here, currently within Hendrix, Kubeflow plays the role of, this is our sort of like primary workflow orchestration platform. Our managed Kubeflow offering consists of two parts here. One is we have a centralized multi-tenant infrastructure so that users don't really need to spin up their own Kubeflow clusters. We handled all that hard stuff for them. And at the same time, we also have an extensible SDK built on top of that. It's based around TFX, TensorFlow Extended. And with that, users can stitch together their pipelines to submit and run on our clusters in this sort of like scheduled, highly rigorous fashion. This SDK, one of the core aspects of that is a collection of what we call core components. These are, you can almost think of as stock tasks that we've sort of like implemented these canonical solutions for, so that users don't really have to do all this work from scratch. They can sort of leverage best practices to accomplish these common tasks. Some of them might be Spotify specific, such as data, like tying into our data platform for access to features, or they can be more general stuff, such as training or data validation. And Kubeflow is such a standard part of our infrastructure, such that we consider it part of what we call the machine learning golden path at Spotify. The golden path at Spotify it's a very Spotify-specific concept, I think. It's this idea that you can have this very robust set of best practices or accepted tooling that you sort of converge around. And that applies for machine learning, it applies for data engineering, and so on and so forth. So it's the promise ultimately to our users is that if you use anything on this golden path, you will have a very robust and very reliable experience. You can probably see where I'm going with this now, but as things have while we've derived a lot of value from this strategy in the early stages, we receive just as much feedback nowadays that the golden path, while it's reliable, the downsides are that it's inflexible. It's really hard to use. I could probably talk all of your ears off about how hard it is to explain Kubernetes to someone who really doesn't want to know what Kubernetes is. But more fundamentally, it's heavily optimized for productionization use cases. And what I mean by that is anything that's involved around getting a model to production and sort of working backwards from that core task. That's all well and good. That was a very, very pointed decision on our part when we first started building this platform. But nowadays, when we're trying to accommodate research scientists and data scientists who might be a little bit less concerned about productionization and more concerned about, hey, I want to try 50 different things, and maybe 49 of them are just complete garbage, and I want to throw those out, but that's okay. I just really want to do that really quickly and find the one thing that works. It turns out that having this sort of really rigorous pipeline-based environment does not really work well for them. And lastly, going back to experiment tracking, we have automated experiment tracking within our Kubeflow infrastructure, but only for the core components. And that becomes a problem when you're a user team and you're trying to do something that's really bespoke and really specific to your use case, and you want to track it. So now you're kind of out of luck now. This is sort of where Ray comes into play for us. I think Ray's been getting a lot of buzz, I think, in the ML space recently, but to give a bit of an overview, it is a open source. They describe it as a unified framework for scaling AI and Python-based applications. It comes to us from our friends at Bear Lab out in Berkeley. They incidentally are the same people that gave us Spark. They have the whole name, they have the pedigree going for them and everything. In our experience, it's helped to provide a really agile environment for experimentation and prototyping for research scientists and data scientists within Spotify. And it gives us that leverage to sort of support broader and more nuanced use cases within Spotify that maybe either don't really match well with this really rigorous pipeline-based methodology, or we just haven't had time to sort of figure out those best practices just yet. Going back to what I said earlier about automated experiment tracking, this becomes a problem now when a user is running experiments on Ray and they don't really have a standardized and really platform accepted way of tracking those experiments. So then the solution that we've decided to land on is, okay, we're going to open up this experiment tracking functionality, this metadata writing functionality to every user of the Hendrix platform. Whereas before, we really treated it as this under-the-hood implementation detail of our Kubeflow infrastructure. Now we're really sort of taking this approach where we're productizing it. We're treating this as another user-facing aspect of Hendrix, such that now, ultimately, this gives our users the freedom to do what they already know how to do, which is, I just want to log stuff and be able to compare it later. I appreciate the platform's help when it offers it, but for the most part, I mostly just need the platform to give me the tooling to do what I already know how to do. And this really ties into our Hendrix platform's ethos moving forward of empowering users where they already are. And this stands in direct contrast to the other really sort of thing that people make fun of centralized platforms for, which is you kind of force users to do things your way and only your way, and you're wrong if you don't do that. Going back to the metadata and experiments for all, we really see a great opportunity for us to leverage this moving forward. Ray is kind of the only the first step there in a lot of ways. We can really think of this pattern as generalizing to a lot of other methods. Say we wanted to increase our, we wanted to provide a much more robust notebook experience for users. I think, ultimately treating metadata propagation as a user feature rather than, say, an implementation detail that you don't trust your practitioners to know how to use. I think this kind of thing will pay dividends for us very nicely in the future. So, in conclusion, I wanted to give you all a sort of preview of what's next, I think, for Hendrix platform. We're gonna, like I mentioned, we are going to continue to expand more into different use cases. ML goes without saying, ever-changing field. We must continually grow and adapt. Otherwise, our platform, it simply will no longer be relevant. At the same time, now that we've coalesced under this Hendrix name, we have a renewed focus on platform cohesion. We want Hendrix to feel like one unified product rather than the other trap that platforms can fall into, where it feels more like 6 or 7 loosely interrelated products that kind of were mostly developed in isolation. And at the same time, we're looking at other ways to expand on our metadata infrastructure. One of those ways is with governance. This idea of model inventories and model cards. This ties back into what Armand earlier was talking about. We want to provide a way for people to generate these model cards for, say, like internal audit to rely on, but in ways that are automated rather than forcing people to write these things by hand, which honestly nobody really wants to do. So that's really all I had for you all today. Thanks for giving me the time, and obligatory, if anything in here sounds interesting, feel free to hit me up. Otherwise, take a look at life@spotify.com/jobs to come join the band, and I will take it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Any questions for Jonathan?
Hi, I got a quick question over here in the back.
Go ahead.
So it seems like Hendrix is a really mature product and it has a lot of success within Spotify. What do you think the appetite of leadership at Spotify is to productize this externally to the company?
That's a really good question. So yeah, in terms of maturity, Hendrix has existed in various forms. Hendrix has existed, I think, since as early back as 2018. It only really recently we decided to actually call it something instead of the Spotify ML platform, which doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. We are always, open source is really something that we take really seriously. We're always looking at ways to or opportunities, we'll call them, to open source bits and pieces as it comes up. Historically, a lot of stuff ends up being kind of Spotify specific, and it becomes hard to sort of pull the Spotify specific pieces out of that. But it's not something we're fundamentally opposed to, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, makes sense. It's kind of going to be like your competitive advantage internally to the company. That's awesome.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of our that's really also a lot of our strength comes from, okay, we really are we're taking care of the integration points within Spotify so that user teams don't have to. User teams can rely on the open source tooling that they already are familiar with, and then sort of fold in the Spotify specific parts where it makes sense.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. So first of all, congratulations. It was a really nice session. I have a question, and it's regarding the adoption process that you needed to go through for practitioners to actually use the platform. I imagine that was hard because practitioners always like to have speed and use their tool they know. So I wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. I will answer this to the best I can, but I'm an engineer, and I am a little less tuned into the product side. But that being said, a lot of our focus has been around, okay, solving the most pressing needs for not just like individual users, but also ML at Spotify as a whole. And I think you can really see that from sort of like the trajectory that Hendrix has taken over the years, where we started off by focusing the most pressing problem at the time, circa 2018, was, okay, we want to get models into production, and that naturally, I think meant we had to de-emphasize a lot of things early on. But I think that's sort of the hard decision that a platform team and a platform org like ours has to make. It's like, would you rather do one thing really, really well, and then before you move on to the next challenge, or would you rather kind of have these 5 or 6 half-baked solutions to everything across the board? And I think we leaned really heavily towards the former approach, and we think that's paid off really big dividends for us. And that now that we're almost at like a stable state in terms of the whole productionization story, that's when we sort of gave ourselves the space to, okay, look back at our initial assumptions. Okay, are we ready to sort of like start tackling these more broader, more nuanced use cases, and then building our tooling up around that? Hope that helps.
One question here. I'm right here. On your right.
Oh, hello.
The question I have is kind of as you reflect back on the genesis of Hendrix and what motivated your team to build it. Was it more of the capabilities that are present, let's say, on, I don't know, open source or the cloud providers who are in the business of building these platforms? Were they inadequate, or they lacked features? Or was it a price consideration? Or was it just a cultural thing where some companies just want to build their own platform? So just wanted you to reflect on that.
I love that question, by the way. It's not. I think there are a lot of factors I think that went into it. I think Spotify is a really heavy user of Google Cloud right now, but I think what we discovered really early on is that ultimately there's always some need for your own sort of like layer on top of these things, whether it's providing these sort of like internal value adds. I talked about integrations with other aspects of the Spotify. Data platform was a really big one for us. But I think ultimately, like, if you any way that you can sort of like streamline things for internal practitioners, that Google Cloud, Vertex AI, Google Cloud AI platform, these are all great. These are all great, really robust things. But they're general. They rightfully don't cater specifically to Spotify needs. So that's one of the big parts about why we have our own platform. In terms of building our own platform for the sole sake of it, I think we're always looking at ways to use open source, whether it be standards or toolings, whenever we can. I think that's really part of our sort of ethos around reevaluating our platform every once in a while. Like a recent thing that came out, I think one of the PMs that I work with called it an unexamined platform is not worth building. So that's really a big part of it. Is I think we're always looking at new ways that we can adopt, and that also applies to this whole build versus buy thing. Like I think the startup scene around ML platforms has really exploded in the last couple of years, and I don't think that necessarily was the case when we first started building it out. So now it's sort of like we're taking these very pointed approaches to sort of looking at vendor options as well. For sure.
Hi, right here. So I really like the ontology approach. You started with the ontology and then trying to define the various models and versions and all these things. I'm curious how often you're having to update that. And where my question is coming from is in my line of work, our modelers usually combine models, split apart models, use them, share them across use cases. And so having a ontology trying to map them out is kind of it seems to put a lot of constraints on what the models want to do. So I was curious how you address that kind of situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first off, the question about how often we've had to update it, this is a really new thing. So we luckily have not actually had to do that just yet. But I think to your other question about okay, does this impose a lot of constraints? I think that sort of comes, I think that's where it really takes really principled sort of like stances from you as a platform developer about what role, what purpose does this ontology serve exactly? Like, are you using, like, we're not building out the Hendrix ontology for ML as like this academic all-encompassing exercise. We're positioning it as like for like a very platform-centric kind of thing. It's like we want this to be the unifying thread across all of our products. So to that end, that really places a lot of constraints on us, right? Like we don't want this to be like overly hyper-specific in these specific places, but we want it to be just specific enough and just general enough that it can act as that unification across all of our products without necessarily tipping the scales towards like any one specific use case, any one product. Hope that makes sense.
You actually let the modelers kind of decide what those various fields mean in the, not mean, like, you know, how they're assigned for a model or for you showed those four or five levels, right? Mm-hmm. So what is exactly a version or what is exactly a variation? That distinction, is it left to the modelers to decide?
It's not left. It's not necessarily left to the modelers per se. It's the kind of thing that we're going to rely on our platform tooling to sort of like help to like guide users towards like setting up the right thing. Like if, for example, like if we have specific definitions for like fields of say like model variant or like what a project even constitutes, right? That's the kind of thing that we're gonna really focus on putting in really robust and flexible validation rules where it makes sense, or like help steer users towards upholding these definitions. But like I said, it's a balancing act ultimately, right? You want to put in as many of these sort of like guardrails without it sort of turning into a tightrope and like inhibiting users' work as a result. Sure.
Any other questions? No? Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Wonderful, wonderful presentation.